Oh, sorry. This will be cut. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the roundtable. What is democratic economic planning? This roundtable explores democratic economic planning, or DEP, as an alternative to the financialized market-based economy, with neoliberalism in crisis and authoritarian movements on the rise. There is a renewed interest in how economies might be organized differently. Any proposal for economic planning has to answer several basic questions, such as how do you gather accurate information about what people need and what resources exist? What do you measure? Things in money, labor time, physical unit, some combination. Uh, who makes decisions and how centralized should that be? Do markets have any role? And if so, what kind of role? How do you motivate work and handle distribution? These questions are not new. They emerged in the socialist calculation debate of the 20s, 30s, and 20th century. Answers have been attempted differently across historical experiments, from Soviet central planning to Child's cyber project to contemporary participatory budgeting initiatives. Today's proposal range from participatory economics to algorithmic coordination models that imagine repurposing Amazon's logistics infrastructure for democratic ends. The roundtable is organized in partnership with the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning, INDEP. At session one, it is the opening session, which will lay the intellectual landscape and the core problems any planning model confronts. We'll look at how these questions connect to contemporary concerns about technology, ecology, and democratic transition strategies. Session two will build from student research to map current debates and identify where productive collective work might happen. As an outcomes, you will understand the fundamental challenges facing economic planning proposals and how different models tackle them. We'll cover key historical debates and experiments along contemporary paradigms that leverage digital infrastructure. You'll gain frameworks for evaluating whether planning proposals are actually democratic and practically viable, plus exposure to real world implementations and transition strategies. You'll and you will connect with other exploring alternatives to market coordination. Our organizers and instructors of these roundtables are Eric Meier and Raphael Arar. Eric Meier is an organizer, researcher, and artist working on democratic economic planning, critical theory, and digital culture. He unites researchers, activists, and practitioners globally to advance the research and practice of democratic approaches to economic organization. He studies sociology and philosophy at the University of Bielefeld and is a certificate alumnus of the Critical Philosophy program at the New Center for Research and Practice. He is a co-founder of INDEP, the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning, where he works as a strategic network facilitator. As an artist, his practice explores the topics of contemporary internet culture, distorted desire, and utopian imagination through digital landscape and video collapse. His artistic practice has been presented at the 2023 exhibition Art Design Aesthetics of Democratic Economic Planning in Bonn, a show he conceptualized, curated, and organized. The Science Fiction Film Festival 2024 in Berlin and the 2025 exhibition Das Privat ist politisch in Bonn. His work also appeared in publications by Rhizomatica, Reincarnamento, the Festival of Network Cultures, and Rebel Review. He's spoken at a range of international events, including 2024 Science Fiction Film Festival Berlin, 2024 London Ecosocialism Conference, 2024 and 25 Future Factory Festivals in Rome, and the 2025 INDEP conference in Montreal. He regularly hosts workshops, moderates panels, and appears as a guest on podcasts discussing democratic futures and transformative imaginaries. Raphael Arar works at the nexus of complex systems, transdisciplinary design, and art-based research. His work highlights the social, political, and economic implications of technological acceleration and human-to-machine interaction. Raphael currently leads design at One Project, an organization building infrastructure for a new economy, where resources serve people and planet, not profit. He also serves as an executive board member at Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Sciences and Technology, and as a mentor at New Inc., a museum-led cultural incubator from the New Museum. Previously, he led design for learners at Khan Academy, tackled ethical platforms of AI at IBM Research, taught media theory at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, and designed over 100 iOS apps with Apple. His artwork has been shown at museums, conferences, festivals, and galleries internationally, including the ZKM Center for Art and Media, Moscow Museum of Applied Art, SLAC, National Accelerator Laboratory, International Symposium on Electronic Art, ICEA, or ICEA, Gamble House Museum, ACM Chai Conference, CHI Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems, Science Gallery, Boston Cyber Arts Gallery, and Athens Video Art Festival. Notable commissions include DubLab, Nemo Magazine, Goethe Institute, Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, Intel Labs, and IBM Research. His design work has been featured in publications including TED, Forbes, Inc. Magazine, Fast Company, Wired, and others. Now, Eric and Raphael, please take it away. I pass it to you.
Great. Thank you. All right, let's get going. All right, so we got bios out of the way. I'm Raphael, as you all know, and over the next few sessions, Eric and I are going to walk you through the landscape of democratic economic planning, what it is, what problems it's trying to solve, how different proposals tackle those problems, and where a lot of the live debates are currently. So this survey or this roundtable is not a pitch for one model, and it's not necessarily a survey of the left. It's also not an exercise in imagining utopias, although we could argue about that. What it is an attempt to take seriously a set of intellectual problems that have been argued over for well over a century. And those problems have real stakes right now. Um, and if we're being honest, they haven't really been solved today. So the dominant coordinating systems of the 20th century aren't working. Financialized capitalism has stopped delivering on the grounds it used to defend itself. Growth rates in advanced economies are stagnating. Investment flows into asset bubbles rather than productive capacity. Ecological limits are being crossed without anything resembling a pricing mechanism that reflects what's really at stake. And the decisions that will shape the next 50 years, artificial intelligence, energy infrastructure, big pharma, the food system, they're being made by a handful of private actors who really don't have any accountability to the people who will live with the consequences. And the 20th century alternative, state socialism, central command planning, collapsed for reasons that are well understood. And that experiment isn't coming back. At least I don't think so, because I don't think it should. But the interesting thing, and the thing that makes this a live moment, is that the old debate between these two systems was never the only debate. there was always this third way, this third path. It was mostly buried, it was occasionally surfacing, and it asked whether economic coordination could be democratic without being either market-driven or command-driven. And market-driven, I'll clarify what we mean by that in a moment. And that's the thread that we're going to trace today. So before I move to the next slide, I want to ask, when you imagine an alternative to capitalism, where does your mind go first? Is it state-run nationalization, worker cooperatives, something else? You can unmute. We'll take one or two. You can also drop something in the chat.
Planning.
Planning. Okay. Anyone else got anything? We got something in the chat. GDR. Yeah. Okay.
For me, it's mostly in the direction of cooperatives and mm, experiments around that sort of like
Yeah.
types of organization. Yeah.
Yeah. Cooperatives for sure. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say additional networks of cooperatives and things like that, and work.
Networks of cooperatives. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That gets us to, I think, this map of the territory. And this isn't exhaustive. And one could argue that it's a pretty reductive way of breaking things down, but I actually think it's quite helpful. So when people discuss economic alternatives, the conversation often collapses on this single axis. There's the market versus planning. But that's not the only dimension that matters. And I think the more useful framing splits are along two axes, which are ownership and coordination. So you can own things privately or you can own things socially. You can coordinate activity through competitive markets or through deliberative planning. So that leaves us with two axes and four boxes. So capitalism in the top left is private ownership with market coordination. State socialism is state ownership and central planning, which was the Soviet model. And then market socialism is this interesting category of models that we won't be covering today. But that's social ownership plus market coordination. So that's worker cooperatives that are competing in markets. Yugoslavia is probably the only serious historical example we have of that. And then there's the fourth box, which we're going to be focusing on today, which is social ownership and participatory planning, and that's democratic economic planning. So most of the energy on the left right now is really concentrated in the market socialism box. That's worker ownership, worker cooperatives, community ownership, public options. In fact, I was just listening to a podcast from Jacobin this morning where it was talking about exactly that, market socialism. And that work is valuable, and I don't want to dismiss it. But I want to make an argument that market socialism alone doesn't solve the problems that we most need to solve. And the caveat here is that, again, this is a reductive, it's not there, there's a lot of overlap. And so when we talk about markets, there's the capital M market, where firms, they might be cooperatives, are competing on profit, right? And then there's market-like forces where you still have the market mechanism, but profit isn't the only driving force around it. So there's some nuance there, and these two things are, can be really overlapping. And I would also argue that no model that's in existence today does one without the other. So like even capitalism in the States where I'm based is probably like the most free market approach. There is still some planning that does happen, right? It might be relegated to the military, but planning does still happen. It's just a small sliver. But it also doesn't happen democratically, which is, I think, what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so market socialism, why I want to surface this as why it has issues and some of the ways that it's been conceived. So one, there's the ecological gap. If you keep market competition as your coordination mechanism, then you can inherit the problems of market failure. So planetary boundaries don't get priced. Worker cooperatives compete against each other, and that competition kind of pushes them to externalize ecological costs the same way capitalist firms do. So changing who owns the firm doesn't necessarily change the signal the firm is responding to. So there's often, you need to have other checks and balances on top of market socialism in order to consider the ecological piece. Second, there's systemic inequality across sectors. So some sectors are easy to cooperatize and are still profitable. In today's world, that might be software, consulting, design. Others are essential and structurally unprofitable. That's kind of the what we call is like the informal economy, right? Care work is one. The other aspects that are part of the economy might be agriculture and public transit. They're not really, they're not very easy to scale like software is, so they're not very profitable. So you're not holistically thinking about those imbalances across industries. So pure market socialism doesn't have an inherent mechanism to correct that imbalance democratically. So you might see a world where high-tech co-ops that are like, uh, the equivalent of a market socialist VC-backed AI company would flourish, whereas hospitals and farms would struggle and are more like oriented to like the material built environment in the built world. Um, the third issue is self-exploitation, and this is a hard lesson that was learned from Yugoslavia. If we had more time in the world, we'd do a deep dive and then probably an entire course or entire session on Yugoslavia and the market socialist experiment that happened there. But the kind of TLDR of that is when cooperatives compete, they face the same pressures that firms do today to cut costs, extend hours, suppress internal dissent that any firm in a competitive market faces. And the fact that the workers own the firm doesn't always change the logic of the market that they're in. They're still operating in this market. It just means they're doing the exploitation to themselves. So slightly better, but still runs into challenges. So the question, which is really the animating question of this entire roundtable, is can we imagine a coordinating system that actually replaces market coordination rather than just changing who owns the means of production within it? And that's what democratic planning is really trying to answer. Okay, so to understand what any serious planning proposal is trying to do, you've got to understand the socialist calculation debate. And this is really the intellectual terrain that pretty much every model that's been conceived of thus far is navigating, whether or not it admits it. I think it was Robin Hahnel who distinguished four phases of this socialist calculation debate, planning debate. So I'm going to take them in order. So phase one is really the 1920s and the 1930s. And the debate opens in 1920 with Ludwig von Mises publishing an essay called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And in it, he writes in a response to the real political situation of post-World War I Europe. Socialist parties had just taken power in Russia, Hungary, Germany, and Austria, and nationalization programs were on the table. So this is really Mises firing kind of the first shot of this debate. And his argument is that in a capitalist economy, prices are formed by competitive producers seeking profit. And those prices serve as signals. They tell you what inputs are relatively scarce, which production methods are efficient, whether a given good is worth producing at all. And if you abolish private ownership of the means of production, you abolish the market for capital goods. And if there's no market for capital goods, no prices. And if there are no prices, there's no rational way to decide how to allocate resources. And socialist calculation, Mises argues, is not just difficult, it's impossible. So Hayek, who's kind of like the villain of this debate, I would say, in many ways, takes up the argument and deepens it. And Hayek's really brilliant and shifts this from a static problem, like how do you calculate equilibrium, to a dynamic one. And markets, Hayek says, aren't just allocation mechanisms, they're discovery mechanisms. And this is like the piece on discovery is like so imminent right now. It's so like any like recent essay on planning is often trying to focus on the discovery problem. He's saying that that markets are these adaptive evolutionary systems. He's actually looking and pulling references from biology. It's a very cybernetic biology-based argument. So the real value of market prices isn't that they reflect static equilibrium. It's that they allow rapid, decentralized responses to unforeseen changes. Changes in technology, changes in preferences, changes in resource availability, even when the underlying causes remain obscure. So we move into phase two. And this is really the 1940s and 1960s. So after World War II, socialism isn't speculative anymore. It exists. And it exists at a pretty massive scale in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And the question stops being, is it possible? And now becomes, how does it actually work? And can it work better? So the key figures in this phase are Kantorovich in the Soviet Union and Kornai in Hungary. So Kantorovich wins a Nobel Prize for linear programming, which is a mathematical technique for optimizing resource allocation under constraints. It's really kind of the input-output tables that the Soviet Union used for planning mechanisms. It's a serious tool, and it's still used today in logistics. Linear programming is quite a big thing. But this phase two debate is stuck on the same issue phase one was. It's still fixated on a static equilibrium. It's still treating the economy as this giant optimization problem with one objective function. So the Soviet planners were really solving the wrong problem, but incredibly competently. They're looking at the economy as a static system, as if everything can be known ahead of time, everything can be calculated. And this like dovetailed with the rise of cybernetics in a way, which is a way of looking at the world in this kind of like everything can be distilled down to these numerical inputs and reflections on society. Um, I think they did tremendous work at solving this problem, but there's a key shift on dynamic equilibrium as opposed to static equilibrium. We then move into phase three, and that's really the post-Soviet phase. So the collapse of the Soviet Union should have ended the planning debate. I think it was Fukuyama who said, the end of history. And so for a decade, or it more or less did. And actually, this is kind of unfortunate timing for some of the models because they arose at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we'll get to those in a moment. But by the late 90s, a small set of thinkers started really picking it back up. So, some of the models, the popular ones, the most well-known ones from Hahnel and Albert, participatory economics, and the one from Paul Cockshott and Alan Cottrell were conceived of in, I think, like 89, 90. And then by the time they all started to ramp up, we started to get a handful more. So they weren't doing it as a defense of the Soviet model, but really as a serious attempt to rethink planning from the ground up. So Robin Hahnel again, who's one of the model makers, calls them the Big Four, and they really arose at this time. So there's the model from Pat Devine called negotiated coordination, the participatory economics model from Michael Albert and Robin Hahnel, the model in the book Towards a New Socialism, which is often kind of colloquially called the cyber communist model from Paul Cockshott and Alan Cottrell. And then less of a concrete model and more of like a series of fragmented sketches and a framework for multi-level democratic MDIC. I'm drawing a blank on the other ones, but we'll get to it. A model slash framework from David Leibman.
I think
And a
it's
lot of these
multi-dimensional iterative coordination was
thank
yeah,
you.
that was yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Um, so a lot of these were like compiled. David Leibman is one of the editors of a Marxist journal called Science and Society, and I think in like sometime in the late 90s, maybe early aughts, they published an issue that was like all about these planning models, and then they did a reprise maybe like a few years ago, which was very very fun. I think they even used the old school cover from the original, which had like old CRT monitors and things. So I'll walk through each of these models in the next section. but we should hold on to the fact that the four of them are trying to answer the Hayek challenge. And they're not ignoring it, but they're trying to design institutions that can do what Hayek said only markets could do. This is a really serious attempt here. Okay, so the fourth phase, the last phase, or sorry, yes, the fourth phase, this should say phase four and not phase three, which is that what we're living in today, post 2008, kind of moving into this derivative upon derivative economy that we're in. And the financial crisis really reopens everything. And critically, at this time, digital infrastructure has transformed what's computationally feasible. So Mises and Hayek were arguing at a time when they assumed that there were clerks with paper ledgers, kind of like the auctioneer trying to collect all this information. But we now have infrastructure inside Amazon and Walmart, as argued in books I think some of you have read, The People's Republic of Walmart, for example, that are already running something that looks a lot like in-kind central planning at continental scale. So this is an argument that's really, if you've been in the planning debate, is kind of repeated ad nauseum. It's kind of like, we have the tools, we can do planning at scale. Why hasn't it happened? And there's of course some nuance there as to why it hasn't. So Yevgeny Morozov is someone who's also picked this question back up and pushed into what digital socialism might look like by referencing Daniel Saros's model. And that's one of the newer models that we'll get to. And that model, which is often called Amazon socialism, because it proposes an algorithmic system based on consumer data. It's almost like imagine you're planning and creating your Amazon wish list, and then you're making your purchase plans. And then the most recent one, which is quite exciting and has opened up a whole new stream of debate, is one from Aaron Beninoff, who has recently written two New Left Review essays. The second one just came out this summer, this past summer, I think. And he tried to reframe the entire debate around what he calls multi-criterial choice. And so I'll come back to these models shortly, but they're quite interesting, especially Beninoff's. All right, so moving on. The big phase four insight. I think I buried the lead in the sense that, like, and Eric wrote in chat, a big computer will plan the economy. So the computational substrate has completely changed. So the calculation Mises said was impossible can now be executed in milliseconds on an infrastructure that already exists. And I would argue that even with AI, it's even more quick potentially. But that doesn't answer Hayek's core challenge, the discovery problem, the tacit knowledge problem. They're still live. But I think it does reopen the space of what's possible and what's thinkable. And we'll get to that, especially the tacit knowledge problem and some of the critiques of planning. All right, so before we get to the models, I think there's a historical note that's really almost impossible to leave out because between the theoretical phases I just walked through, there was an actual attempt to build this. So I think many of you are probably familiar with the Cybersyn projects. It's such a critical part of this history. So for those who are not, from 1971 to 1973, under Salvador Allende's government in Chile, a team led by the British cybernetician Stafford Beer built Project Cybersyn. It was an early computer network designed to manage the nationalized sector of Chile's economy in something close to real time. So factories that were nationalized fed production data via telex, the computational like standard at the time, to one single IBM mainframe in Santiago. So there were algorithms that flagged anomalies, a futuristic operations room designed by Guy Monsepi. You've probably seen pictures of. Here's one. It was designed so a small group of decision makers could see the state of the economy at a glance and intervene. It was based on, Stafford Beer's VSM model, the viable systems model, really thinking about federated, decentralized coordination. But I want to be honest about what Cybersyn was and wasn't. It was a prototype. By September 1973, maybe a quarter of the nationalized sector was feeding into it. The telex network was patchy. The operations room was more of a demonstration than an operational tool. It was really kind of vaporware. And whether the system would have scaled, we'll never know. On September 11th, 1973, Pinochet's coup, backed by the US government, overthrew Allende, and the operations room was literally smashed with hammers. So two things about this are worth sitting with, though. The first is on tempo. I think Cybersyn was trying to operate on a daily feedback loop in 1972 with telexes and a single mainframe. And every theoretical model we're about to look at assumes an annual planning cycle, with the exception of, I think, Benanov's newer one. The ambition for real-time coordination existed 50 years ago, and the theoretical literature has largely retreated from it rather than pushing further into it. So that retreat is worth interrogating, and it's been a big curiosity of mine as well. Would love to have a discussion with you all about it. The second one that's important is political. So Cybersyn had technical limits. It might well have failed on its own terms, especially even if it was supported and backed and there was no political opposition. But it really didn't even get the chance to find that out. It was destroyed. And that's a reminder that the question of whether democratic economic planning is possible isn't only a design question or a computational question. Power doesn't just give itself up because you've built a better coordination mechanism. So Eden Medina's Cybernetic Revolutionaries is the definitive history. If you want to go deeper on this, I'd highly recommend that book. But for now, we can hold Cybersyn as a live reference point, and some version of it has already been tried. So now we'll look at the models. Okay, so this is a map of the models, at least the ones that we'll be focusing on today. So there's five that I wanted to highlight, and I've plotted them on two axes. So the vertical is really how centralized the decision-making process is. The horizontal is how much it relies on algorithmic versus participatory mechanisms. And each model sits somewhere on this grid, and the position tells you something about the trade-offs that they're making. So I'll walk you through five of the models. We don't have time to go into big detail on all of them, but hopefully it'll give you a taste of what each model is proposing and how they differ. So for each one, I'm going to describe the core mechanism, name one of the core limitations that I see. I'll show you a diagram that I've created to help make the planning mechanism concrete. And after each one, I will pose maybe a stress test scenario if we have time, mindful of time. You don't need to solve the stress test scenario. It's just kind of a question to maybe get you to feel where the gaps are. And just to note here that these are two axes that made sense to me. They might not be the only axes that we use to plot these. So a fun exercise, if you all are super interested in this, is to actually think through what are are there better axes? So I'd encourage you to explore that. All right, so we'll start with participatory economics. It's Paracon for short. It's probably the most fully worked out of these models. It's been continuously updated for like I don't know, 30 years at this point. Um, it's built around worker councils and consumer councils. So every worker participates in annual planning for what their workplace will produce, and every consumer participates in annual planning for what they'll consume. So you're part of these, like, you wear two hats as a worker and as a consumer. And those plans get reconciled through an iterative procedure. You propose, you see what other propose, you revise, you propose again, and after several rounds, the plans converge. So the way this it happens is from this like social cost to benefit ratio, and there's a threshold, and if if plans meet this threshold, they kind of move forward, and when they conflict, they go back. And Hanel and his team have modeled this out to show that it actually can happen quite quickly. Um, so that's TBD. It's all a model and a simulation. Compensation in this model is based on effort and sacrifice, not on market value of what you produce. Workplaces use balanced job complexes where everyone has a mix of empowering and rote tasks. So, in a worker cooperative, maybe I'm in the bike shop. I'm part of a worker cooperative bike shop. I have to have a balanced job where I not only get to do the fun stuff of fixing bikes, but I also got to clean the toilets in the bathroom from time to time. So it's like the idea is you have distributed labor there. And there's a pollution demand revealing mechanism that they added pretty recently, I'd say in the past 10 years, when a lot of these models came under hot fire in their lack of considering ecology, also considering feminist economics. A lot of these models were really written and composed in a previous era of which we can get into as some of the critiques. But the pollution demand revealing mechanism is essentially like a local Pigouvian tax for handling environmental externalities. So some of the strengths, Pericon takes the Hayek challenge seriously, tries to build a decentralized information-rich procedure that surfaces preferences and local knowledge without relying on market prices. And it's really one of the most complete models that we have. But the limitations are the iterative procedure generates a lot of information. And some critics say it generates too much. It assumes annual planning cycles. It optimizes toward what amounts to a single objective expressed through the social benefit to social cost ratio. And above the workplace, decisions are really parametric, not political. There's no real mechanism for deep political deliberation. And also, one of the other arguments I'd make is the lack of choice and discovery. I remember talking to Robin, and he was like, "Oh, I was talking to my students, and they were like, what about going to the mall? Like people like going to the mall." And he's like, "I don't know. My wife buys everything, all my clothes, and does my grocery shopping." So it's like, oh, okay. Can kind of tell the orientation that he maybe came from when he first conceived of the model. For the speculative design nerds, I thought it would be a good exercise to design a prototype app for what Paracon could feel like. And this helped me make things more concrete and to make it feel more like, okay, what are the limitations here? So the participation question got very concrete and fast, and kind of like, will people actually want to engage with annual planning? So the interface starts to surface the problem in a way that the book doesn't necessarily. So I have a stress test, but I am thinking about the interest of time, and I really want to get to discussion and conversation. So I'm gonna skip over that. We have some other interactive elements later. Um, one of the things is like showing here how it might work for consumer choices, paper towels, hand soap, toilet paper. And then also for public projects, really thinking about like, what does it mean to fund a vaccine for another pandemic? What does it mean to plan for a new library that's going to happen? How are you able to do that, and how are you able to put it against each other as well? All right, the next one is democratic or negotiated coordination. So Pat Devine, who started this model and then ended up working with a colleague, Fikret Adaman. He starts from a very different place. So Devine argues that economic decisions are inherently political. They always involve value choices, trade-offs, winners and losers, and trying to depoliticize them through either markets or algorithms is a mistake. So his model builds in negotiated coordination bodies at multiple scales where stakeholders, workers, consumers, communities, users of infrastructure actually end up negotiating with each other about major economic decisions. So key concept from Devine is that the distinction between primary and secondary uncertainty. So he argues that primary uncertainty is the irreducible uncertainty of living in a changing world, so weather, new ideas, shifting needs, whereas secondary uncertainty is the uncertainty generated by atomized markets themselves, because you don't know what other producers are planning to do. So Devine's argument is that markets address primary uncertainty reasonably well, but generate enormous secondary uncertainty, and that uncertainty is unnecessary. So some of the strengths, I think Devine takes politics seriously, and he really grounds the model in historical analyses of the Soviet experiment, Hungary as well, who had a form of like a hybrid planned market socialist approach, often called goulash socialism. I recently learned about that term and love it. And then the Yugoslav experience. And he acknowledges that democratic planning will involve conflict. We can't avoid that. And instead, we should try to build institutions for negotiating through it rather than pretending conflict can be optimized away. So the big limitation that is probably very obvious is that this requires an enormous amount of political negotiation capacity. The coordination bodies he describes would need to be staffed, informed, genuinely deliberative at many levels simultaneously, which is an extraordinarily demanding institutional design. And you get the sense that from reading Divine that his model assumes a political culture that, at least where I live, is currently is non-existent. People just don't want to engage in that form of debate. And it kind of reminds me of this, I'll paraphrase Oscar Wilde's quote, which is like, socialism would be great if it weren't for all the long evenings. So it's like, you imagine thinking about how do we manage this conflict and have all these discussions and conversations, which, I think a lot of people have limited capacity for, and we certainly don't have that democratic muscle in today's society, at least in the Western world. So the next model, towards a new socialism from Paul Cockshott and Alan Contrell, and it takes a kind of like a polar opposite approach. It proposes a labor time-based accounting system, central price determination, and algorithmic resource allocation using linear programming. They conceived of this kind of at the end of the Soviet experiment, and they really take the computational optimism of phase two and push it hard. They're essentially arguing that modern computers can make Kantorovich's dream finally feasible. So the strengths is that it's like a rigorous plan. It engages directly with Hayek on his own terms and makes a serious argument that computation has changed what's possible. And in many ways, it was very much ahead of its time. Like Paul Cockshott writing this in the 1990s, and like computational power was not where it is today and even 10 years after. Its core limitation, though, is that it's thin on participation. Major decisions are getting made algorithmically with democratic input that's limited to really periodic referenda. There's no real synthesis of central and decentralized elements. The model tends toward a technocracy of really the programmers and statisticians who run the optimization engine, and that way it kind of mirrors some of Keynes's thoughts on like, hey, the economy should be run by technocrats. And there's reasonable concern, and this will be taking us to Benioff's point in a minute, that a single objective optimization, even if it's democratically parameterized, misses on what Benioff calls the multi-criterial nature of real economic choice, which is really like a plurality of possibilities. Some, again, pros and cons. So now we'll move into David Leibman's approach, the multi-level democratic iterative coordination approach, which is really explicitly synthetic. And I think is one of the benefits, and the downside is that he really hasn't fleshed this out in real time or at the same level of detail as the other models. So he's trying to integrate insights from Pericon, from Devine, from Cockshott and Cottrell, as opposed to just picking one. So they're both centralized and decentralized components, both algorithmic and participatory mechanisms, an iterative procedure that moves between scales. The strengths is that the synthesis is honest about the need for both central and decentral, both technical and political, both plan and some role for market-like mechanisms. But of course, the limitation is that it's not a complete formalized system. It's more of this meta framework than buildable spec. And that's not necessarily a fault. And Leibman is arguably right that a full formalization is premature. But it leaves the model harder to evaluate and implement than others, even as a speculative design experiment. All right, then we're moving into like the newest model, which is Daniel Saros's model, which uses a general catalog, which is a continuously updated digital registry of all producible goods and services. So that is combined with a point allocation system where consumers express demand using non-transferable planning points rather than money. And production is coordinated algorithmically based on the demand signals, with a split between producer tokens here for the B2B side of like, how do I get the inputs for what I need to produce? And consumer credits for the household side. So the strengths, it's the most digitally native. It takes seriously what digital infrastructure makes possible. It has one of the few serious answers to preference aggregation at scale. And the limitations is that it's thin on deliberation. The general catalog aggregates preferences, but doesn't create space for collective reasoning about what should be on the catalog in the first place, or about long-term investment decisions that can't be reduced to consumer demand. And yes, the diagrams can be made available after the fact. I think this recording will also be accessible to you, can provide diagrams after. I think one thing to note with all these models is that the consumer token piece is a really key part of any democratic economic model, planning model, in that they expire. They're non-transferable tokens. So they're kind of like a movie ticket. And this is like actually building off of Marx's critique of the Goethe program. It's like they're a movie ticket that just gets torn up upon use. So it's not exchangeable. So like you can't do the kind of MCM prime of a Marxist approach is they're not like capital producing mechanisms. They're just vouchers essentially. So this is another one that I made an effort to prototype because there were some mechanisms that I thought were interesting. Like if you the less you plan in your list, the more conservative you are in your choices, the more bonus points you get. So you get like bonus points. It's very gamified in many ways, and I don't know, there are aspects of it that feel very comical to me. But you prototype Saros's general catalog, and as an interface, it really does look a lot like Amazon, or it lends itself to Amazon-like qualities. It's like an e-commerce store, and I think the same thing goes with most planning mechanisms. If you try to prototype software, at least in many ways, I mean, there are, I think, new chat-based ways you could think through how you might plan with an LLM and these sorts of things that are fun experiments that I started to dabble on. But the point here is that Saros is reinventing Amazon, because the underlying logic is totally different. It's that the interface patterns we've inherited from e-commerce will shape how people experience whatever planning infrastructure we build. So it's a design problem that the theoretical models don't engage with, and it matters, in many ways. Like it's hard to think through from a layer of abstraction, but like Saros's model its strength is that it meets people where they're at with the kind of infrastructure that they might they're used to, which in many ways is also like a weakness of the model because it like adopts the dominant paradigm and then kind of like just slightly extrapolates from there. And so you run into I think similar challenges of like it's very individualized. It doesn't think about collectivism in many ways. It doesn't think about deliberative spaces for planning. And that part is totally thrown out the window in Saros's model. All right, so one reason I started making these diagrams is that the models exist as books and papers, and they're embedded in specialist prose, and rendering them as visual artifacts with a consistent language and invites comparison in a way prose resists. I think this is a core tenet for the speculative designers in the room of why speculative design matters. So I applied that toolkit here. But for me, it also helps surface questions that the prose hid. Where does conflict resolution actually happen? What occurs when communities disagree? How does the model handle surprise? They're pretty light on crises. So there's a pandemic that happens. What happens there? How do we plan quickly enough to address it? What happens if there's an entirely new technology that gets developed through an investment mechanism that we didn't think through? Someone comes across some discovery. There's a crop failure. The diagrams help to make some of this visible, and the models themselves often don't answer them in just their core explanation. All right, so I briefly mentioned Otto Neurath, I think, and this is really where he matters as we start to move into this new contemporary phase of a multi-criterial planning mechanism. So Otto Neurath was a Viennese polymath. He was trained in mathematics, physics, economic history. He also became a designer. He ran logistics on the Galician front in World War I. And he watched the wartime economy give way to something he called the administrative economy. And he started thinking about what a post-capitalist coordinating system might actually need to do. And I think his breakthrough, which got underappreciated for about a century, was to see that planning is not a technical problem with one optimal solution. It's a political problem of navigating incommensurable values. His famous line that I'm paraphrasing is that the choice between producing more coal and producing more clothing cannot be reduced to a common metric. You can't convert one into the other. The choice is ethical and political, and it has to be made democratically and not computed. And this is the move that the Longa learner model responds to Hayek misses. So the Longa learner model was a market socialist model, and they tried to beat Hayek at his own game. They tried to reproduce market efficiency without private ownership. And Neurath said that the game itself is wrong. So efficiency isn't the right objective. Or rather, it's just one objective among several. And no metric can tell you how to trade it against ecological integrity, working conditions, care, or equity. So what's really striking is that Neurath also understood that this would require a design response. You can't have meaningful democratic economic choice if ordinary people can't understand what they're choosing between. So Neurath developed the isotype system, the International System of Typographic Picture Education, which is a visual language designed to help semi-literate and semi-numerate populations inform themselves about economic trade-offs. He produced a bunch of data visualizations, way ahead of his time, produced this elaborate iconography system. Um, I think it's very notable and inspiring because it's probably the first serious piece of design work that was explicitly undertaken in service of democratic economic planning. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about Neurath because the design research I've been doing, planning diagrams, but also cultural ephemera like posters, handbooks, tax guide parodies, is in some sense, I would say, minimally following in this lineage. I'm not specifically trying to I just think the problem hasn't gone away, and I don't see folks exploring it head on. So if we're going to have a democratic economy, people need to be able to see what they're deciding between, and that's a design problem. And it's been a design problem since 1925. And so it's both very technical and functional, but also thinking about the kind of context around planning. Like, how do people actually understand what it is? How do we think through what it means to build democratic muscle so that people actually know what that looks like and know how to participate. All right, so let's move into Benioff and then we'll start to wrap. So Aaron Benioff has done the most interesting contemporary update of the Neurath Insight. He's published 2 essays in You Left Review, which I strongly encourage reading, Beyond Capitalism 1 last year and Beyond Capitalism 2 this summer. If we had more time, I'd invite him over to give a little guest lecture on that. Maybe we'll save that for another course. So part 1 lays out the diagnosis. Part 2 proposes the institutional architecture. There's a lot that he didn't even get to in part 2. But I want to take both seriously because I think this is at this moment the most detailed new proposal in the field. So the diagnosis part, Benioff's argument is that the whole planning literature, from von Mises through Lange, through the Paracon model, through Cockshott, has been stuck trying to find the right single objective function. And what if instead we recognize that real economies face genuinely plural goals? Efficiency, sustainability, equity, quality of work, autonomy. They can't really be, which can't be collapsed into one metric. So his proposal is what he calls structured multi-criterial choice under a budget constraint. Costs that are measured in labor, materials, time can be added up in a common unit, and that's a real commonality. But benefits cannot. Benefits are plural and irreducible. So planning procedure operates like this. You bound the space of feasible action within a budget. You use technical reasoning to rule out dominated options. This is from the more mathematical and scientific approaches. So dominated options are options where every dimension is worse than some alternative. And among the remaining non-dominated options, you deliberate politically and choose. So he borrows a term from rational choice theory that these are partial order problems. Options can be partially ranked and ordered, but not fully so. So technical reasoning only gets you part of the way, and then judgment has to do the rest. So he's identifying a core gap of like the cybernetics field in the 60s, which actually thought that you can make everything technical reasoning. Um, but he's saying it's not an either or, it's a both and. So let's see if we have time. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the exercise. But this is essentially trying to get at what does it mean to have a partial order um, option and which one is dominated. So here we have three proposals. Proposal A is high density three proposals for a community deciding on how to build housing development, how to do housing development. So proposal A is high density, moderate cost, high ecological impact, strong community character. Proposal B is medium density, high cost, low ecological impact, weak community character. And proposal C is low density, high cost, high ecological impact, and weak community character. So which one of these is dominated and which are non-dominated? And what would you need to know to choose among the remaining ones? So the answer is C is the dominated proposal because it's worse than A on every dimension except possibly density, which may or may not be qualified as a benefit. A and B are non-dominated and they're Pareto rivals. So choosing between them requires political judgment about what the community values. And an algorithm can't resolve this. So that's kind of this is like the intellectual landscape here of this, what a partial order option and problem might involve. So technical reasoning can rule some things out. Politics needs to really handle the rest. And critically, the politics is not a failure of the system, it's the point. So in part two, Benioff goes further. So this is a diagram of what dominated and non-dominated options look like. He published part two with an actual institutional design, and I want to walk through the skeleton because if you come to session two having read it, I think you'll want to engage with it concretely. So he proposes a series of structural breaks. Capital accumulation and wage labor are both abolished. All firms are nonprofit, worker managed, publicly owned. So this is very common in the literature and approaches of DEP. Universal basic services and a universal basic income are the enabling condition. So nobody has to work to survive, and that's the floor. So everyone's existential basic needs are met. And then the architecture has four components. First, there's a dual currency system, which is the critical move. So he borrows this from Soros. There are two digital currencies, credits and points, that are not convertible. So credits are used by individuals for personal consumption, and points are used by firms and associations for inter-firm transactions and investments. Yes, I am showing the right slide. Um, they exist in separate circuits. You cannot turn credits into points or points into credits. This is what severs the link between market exchange and private accumulation. So markets still exist, firms still choose suppliers and still experiment and still respond to demand, but nobody can accumulate surplus into capital. He credits Soros as an inspiration, but he implements it pretty differently. The second one for the tech nerds among us is the data matrix, which is an open digital ledger that tracks flows of points and credits. The latter, the credits, are anonymized and it happens in real time. It runs forecasts. It runs counterfactual what if simulations. So for the foresight people, this is for you. It's not an optimization engine, it's transparency and deliberation tool. Anyone can query it. So imagine having this public data matrix that you can go in, you can say, what if we did this instead of this? And Benioff explicitly invokes Neurath-style visualizations. There's isotype-inspired interfaces that he describes or imagines that render the statistical picture legible for democratic debate. And third, there are investment boards, sector-specific bodies, housing, transportation, healthcare, and so on, that decide how to allocate investment points across proposals. They're composed of workers, consumers, community representatives, and technical experts. So you're thinking about a broad mix where firms make proposals and then boards select amongst them. There are three nested levels of decision. There are small upgrades, strategic investments, cross-sectoral transformations like decarbonization. So he's thinking about those industry-wide challenges that, again, was one of the gaps of market socialist models. And fourth, there are technical associations, and these handle wages, recruitment, training, and research like professional guilds crossed with trade unions. And critically, wages flow through the associations to workers as credits. So firms rent labor from the associations paying in points, and then two currencies never meet. So this is a really different approach to labor and employment. So Benioff's model is ultimately a sixth model on the table. It's still, I think he's been on some podcasts and I've had conversations with him where he has a lot more fleshed out. I know he's working on a book which will come out very soon. So pretty excited about that. So market exchange, again, we haven't abolished markets. They're preserved for inter-firm coordination, but they're not markets that run on profit because there's this non-convertible dual currency that severs accumulation from exchange. So going to that point on the movie voucher piece. There's democratic investment through sectoral boards, which is trying to get at the discovery thing. And then there's a universal basic income plus universal basic services as the enabling condition. And the data matrix is the transparency layer. So my honest take is that Benioff has done something that I think is genuinely important. The dual currency mechanism is a cleaner answer to the problem that really killed Yugoslav market socialism. The partial order framing gives you a principled way to combine technical reasoning with political deliberation. And the data matrix for the design-minded among us is explicitly Neurath, lineage, and this computational isotype. But, and this is the hinge into my last section, Benioff's architecture is still an architecture, a specific institutional proposal. It assumes a lot about political culture, about the legitimacy of sectoral boards, about what counts as a sector, about who gets to participate. And it is, by his own admission, necessarily underspecified, which is a virtue, but also means it lands differently in San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, than in Sao Paulo, than in rural Alabama, than in Berlin, than in Kiev. And that's the hinge. So I think there are six serious proposals. All of them are trying to answer real problems. None of them obviously right for every context. So what do we do? I think standing back from these six models, you can see a rough consensus. Democratic control over economic priorities, social rather than private ownership of productive assets, transparency of information, participation beyond formal voting, some synthesis of centralized and decentralized coordination, and some integration of ecological and social factors into planning as constitutive and not as externalities. That, I would argue, is the floor. Every serious proposal agrees on that much. Where they differ is in the mechanisms. So every model has a limitation. I didn't include Benioff's here because I frankly just need to know more. But Paracon gets overwhelmed by information. Negotiated coordination demands more political capacity than any existing society has, at least the Western world, I would argue. The cyber communist model is pretty technocratic. MDIC is incomplete. Digital socialism under-deliberates. Benioff's architecture, elegant but unproven, and like the others, still singular. And every one of them, except maybe Benioff's, assumes annual planning and single objective optimization. So I want you all to name one protocol or one thing that you think any democratic planning system would need, regardless of which model it sits inside. You can drop it in the chat or just go off mute.
I'm sorry, Raphael, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what's a protocol or one thing that you think any democratic planning system would need, regardless of which model it sits inside? One principle, one thing.
Yeah. I was thinking, I mean, when you show the previous slide, I was
Hmm.
wondering if any of those principles included the idea that the economic system should serve primarily to serve human and planetary needs rather than accumulation or profit. So that's
Yeah.
one principle that I think it should be, basic, and perhaps it's already included in one of your principles, but that's it's something that came to mind.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like the social ownership, I would say. Um, Gets into that piece and then democratic control. So I would argue that democratic control is really important because the people can then decide what they want. And I would argue that most people would probably not say, hey, we want to profit and exploit other people at all costs. But maybe it needs to be a more core principle. Leonard?
I don't know really where this fits in, but something I've been curious about with planning models is um, how one kind of accounts for or fits in um, the things that we kind of see with entrepreneurship in kind of capitalist models or innovation, basically. Like what are the how does one design these institutions to actually kind of have some innovation in systems like this? This might kind of not really be in this area, but that's something I've kind of been wondering about.
Yeah, I think that's one innovation is a core piece. Absolutely. We'll get to that, I think, and we can have more discussion about that when we wrap. Jeff?
Yeah, further to Leonard's point, just yeah, incentive and things like that. I mean, I think it's addressed to an extent, but it's just that's a key when you talk to people about this. That's kind of the first thing that comes to people's when I talk to people, it's often the first thing that comes to my kind of people's minds. But I'd say the component that I'm most interested in and I think is really like I'm really Neurath kind of coded and I think that the idea of this the data matrix or at least the transparency the kind of communications tools to be able to like the informational aspects of democracy are really uh, interesting to me here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay.
And there is
Let's
another thing that I'm just
please.
curious about.
Yeah.
Maybe we will cover this. What I've been wondering about when it comes to kind of some of these models, when they're when there is kind of like we settled on something, what do we do if it kind of, turns out halfway through it that this is not working? Like, do we have units that also kind of go and experiment with alternatives? Um, or does everyone kind of go in one direction? That's something which I think in a capitalist model, there are people who try out different things, or even in a kind of market model, and not necessarily
Yeah.
capitalist.
I think that, I mean, that's such a core point, and I think it's a big limitation of a lot of these models because I think you can look at that at two levels. One is like within the model itself, and the other is more of like a meta look at the model itself. Like, what if the whole mechanism isn't working? How are we thinking of ways to not do it? And I think one of the core limitations is around transition plans. Like a lot of them, I think Benioff is one who takes it quite seriously of like how do you transition into his model? Like, and that's something that he's only talked about. I don't, I think he's working on writing something. So I think these other models actually assume there's some sort of rupture. You can like flip on a switch and be like, hey, okay, it's time to do Paracon. We're out of, free market capitalism. Now we're in Paracon. And I think in the absence of thinking through transition mechanisms, it's really difficult to then move into that. Like, if you haven't transitioned into it, I think it's also very hard to think through how do you course correct if it's not working and like what can you modify. I think those two things are related in some ways. So that's a good point. Okay, let's continue and then we can have more discussion. So what I want to leave you with at the end of session one, all these models, including Beninof's, assume that there's one right way to organize democratic planning. And my take is I don't think there is. I think different communities will have different values, different contexts, and different capacities. And as I mentioned, what serves Oakland doesn't serve rural Louisiana or Sao Paulo or Berlin. And so what we need is not necessarily a better model. I think we need infrastructure, better protocols that can host multiple models, let them evolve, let them interoperate, let communities design planning systems adequate to their own circumstances. So again, this is like a big philosophical thought experiment. But I would say we want infrastructure over imposition. And so that's something that I've been working on and thinking about in efforts to build infrastructure for economic democracy. But I also have been exploring it from a speculative standpoint. And so maybe this is something to get the wheels turning in a sense, which is prototype I've been calling Praxis. It's a platform that presents canonical planning models as repositories in the spirit of open source software, where communities can adopt a model wholesale. They can fork it to create variants. They can compose hybrid systems by taking components from different models. There's this simulation sandbox, so you can stress test the system before implementing it. The deeper goal is what I sometimes call a model of models. It's a meta framework where different communities running different planning systems can still coordinate through shared protocols. So I'm not, I hope I'm clear that I'm not claiming this platform praxis is the answer. It's really just a speculative exercise. But I think the move it represents is democratizing the system design itself and pluralizing it at the infrastructure level rather than the model level feels like the right direction. So the best planning model probably hasn't been written yet, and it probably won't be a single system. It'll be a pluriverse of approaches connected through shared infrastructure. So before I wrap, I want to do a quick acknowledgement before we close. The five models I've walked you through are not the entire field. They're really the canonical models, plus Saros, plus Benioff. There are at least four other traditions I have engaged with that I think deserve to be on the map. They've been worked on pretty seriously. There's a model called commonism that comes out of the, more of an autonomous tradition by a couple authors, Meritz and Sutterluti. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, where they orient toward commons-based production beyond both market and the state. I think it's less worked out in its institutional architecture and more of a strategic orientation, and it pairs naturally with degrowth thinking. A collective out of Berlin, actually, called IDA, develops the Council Communist labor time accounting tradition that goes back to the Group of International Communists in 1930. That's a book that's become like a research cult classic in a way. It's this group of international communists run by a guy named Appel, I think a Dutch activist and theorist who really took like Marx's little paragraphs from the critique of the Goethe program and extrapolated an entire um, model from it, which is really centered on council communism, labor time accounting. So it overlaps with Cockshot and Cottrell on the unit of count, but it differs significantly on the political grounding with federations of workplace councils rather than central planning. So that's one that's been pretty recently discussed. Eric from INDEP has hosted the IDA before. There's a book that just came out by Jasper Burns where I think he talks about like, I forget the title, is something about revolution. Maybe y'all can find it after the fact. And there's a big section critiquing the model from the GIC. There's Half-Earth Socialism, which I think New Center folks are probably familiar with. It's a 2022 book from Troy Vettis and Drew Pendergrass, and it's the most ecologically explicit of the recent proposals. It's centrally planned under hard ecological caps, and really the mechanism really just takes linear programming to its fruition. So it's really close to Cockshot and Cottrell on coordination mechanism, but they insert a binding ecological constraint. That binding constraint is like rewilding half the planet and telling everyone to be vegan as the architectural priority. I think it's an interesting provocation with a lot of holes. And then there's a new model, CDEP, Cybernetic Democratic Economic Planning, by Walter Zug and Jacob Heyer. I am butchering their names. Eric, don't hate me. Native German speakers, don't hate me. This one is recent, and their main paper came out in June. It uses three binding budget tokens: raw material consumption, climate footprint, and working time. It really thinks about ecological metabolism. And so those budget tokens are downscaling planetary and social boundaries to per capita allocations. So it's really the most metabolically rigorous of the current proposals. There's a lot that they've done. And there's a great talk, INDEP. There's a recording that we can share after the fact as well. So if you've engaged with any of these in your own work or come across them, I'd love for that to come up in some of the interventions. I think they each occupy ground that the five models we walk through don't fully cover. So close with where the field is, what exists. There are 6 theoretical proposals of real intellectual weight, none of them fully implemented at national scale. There's a serious historical attempt, Cybersyn. I think there's a set of adjacent contemporary experiments, which is out of scope to talk about, but it's really important to look at some of the smaller scale stuff that's happening. There's notably participatory budgeting that happened in Porto Alegre in the 90s. There are platform cooperatives. Subvert is a new one that's coming up. Mondragon, the world's largest worker cooperative. Community land trusts. There's growing academic interest. There's a really recent debate between Morozov and Beninoff in the ideas letter that I would encourage you all to read. It gets pretty heated. It's kind of a fun read, very polemical. Um, and there's a small but real international network, and that's what INDEP is, which we're so happy to be doing this in partnership with, which is why Eric is here. So what's needed, I would say, is moving from annual to something closer to real-time coordination, the ability to hand plural and commensurable values computationally, the enablement of different models to interoperate, and maybe most importantly, actual testing in real communities at scales where you can learn from failure without catastrophic downside. That would be ideal. So I want to leave you with one framing. Frederick Jameson, reading Kevin Lynch, wrote that the incapacity to map socially is as crippling to political experience as the analogous incapacity to map spatially is for urban experience. So Mark Fisher's term for the symptom of that incapacity was capitalist realism, the sense that there is no alternative because we can't even see one. The work of democratic planning is, in part, the work of making the alternative visible enough to argue about. Better theory matters, better infrastructure matters, but better maps also matter. And until people can see what they'd be choosing, the choice isn't really available to them. So with that, I will pause here and thank you so much for your time and attention, and we can open it up for discussion.
Yeah, short procedural question. We wrote on the reading list that okay, you were asked to prepare like an around 10-minute presentation based upon the readings, because I already see we're like 1.5 hour or a little bit less in. How do you want to proceed? Like first the presentations, first discussion, or like some quick questions about the presentation? What do you think, Raphael?
I think let's see on time. So Sislav, do we have until the hour? Can we go a little bit after? Do we lose you?
Maybe he's AFK for the moment.
Okay. So let's plan to stop at the hour then. Just so who has prepared, let's move into the interventions. Who has prepared an intervention or a talk or something that they would like to share? Has anyone? This is not a graded course, so. Jeff, I see you go off
Yeah,
mute.
I did prepare a little deck. It's mostly to do with kind of my background as relates to the readings.
Okay. Anyone else?
No, I couldn't. I was only able to access the materials last night. I
Yeah.
prepared some notes, but not a presentation as such.
Okay. Has anyone else prepared notes? Joshua?
Prepared something brief on relating to my current project on tourism that I was talking about, and I tried to kind of vaguely map it onto the text that we read, but it's a sketch. Yeah.
Great. And Lenart, anything? No
No,
issues if not.
I have some kind of questions, but no real presentation. That was actually why I shifted over into audit because I was like, well, I haven't prepared presentations.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, this is
um,
great. Okay. So why don't we, in the interest of time, why don't we go through the folks who have prepared something, even if it's a sketch or notes or whatever. I would love to hear what you all are working on, and if you want to intersperse any questions or curiosities in that process, great. And then after that, we'll just open it up for general questions and discussion, and we can take that and carry it over into next week on session 2. So, Jeff, would you like to kick us off since it sounds like you prepared the most robust out of
I don't know
anyone?
about robust, but yeah, it's prepared. Sorry, just to clarify, how much time do I have? Like,
Let's keep it brief. So, I don't know, 5 minutes or so.
yeah, sounds good. I will share my screen. Um, use.
It's working.
It's working. So yeah. So again, my name is Jeff. I already introduced myself. I just wanted to add that I previously worked in strategic foresight in government and Ministry of Energy, and also did war game design with an international defense think tank. So my background it was in really doing the strategic foresight through serious games through these vehicles, and that really reflects what I'm going to talk about as it relates to democratic economic planning. So my current research is really about this idea of strategic amnesia in municipal planning and municipal kind of political economic judgment in a participatory way. So it's how do we use games like as kind of citizens' assemblies to through co-design, play, and deliberation to address like issues in Alberta, the province where I live, regarding things like oil sands pollution. Um, Data centers is a big issue in rural areas. So indigenous would be the oil sands pollution. So at different levels, rural would be data centers in there and the water use and things like that, and then urban sprawl in the urban centers. And so it's kind of dealing using these games to deal with like kind of mitigating or working through long-term issues and deliberating on them in a way that kind of mitigates this kind of strategic amnesia or the breakdown or siloization of knowledge and accountability, both between people in the jurisdiction and the government. So that's the kind of research that I'm doing right now, and I'll get into why I think it's related in a second. But I'm hoping to propagate the use of these policy games and applied games across Canada through a kind of a non-traditional thesis that builds on them. But I've done this work before in the colleges and in the government and things like that. This is a messy slide, but it's just the general thinking of like how I moved into this, and that was generally from this economic calculation debate, socialist calculation debate, but really from a more mainstream and progressively more kind of heterodox, pluralistic, and I think progressive perspective over time. And yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Um, I think that my games work is really kind of relatively micro in terms of how like dealing with specific issues in specific contexts and working through that. But I'm a pretty big picture thinker overall, and I'm kind of interested in both how games and gameful thinking can be used to explore the kind of macro meta models of and meta of the models that we've explored and kind of experiment with them, kind of as Raphael is doing to kind of test them out, to reconfigure them, to have a framework for playing through their implications and so forth. But also the research that I'm doing specifically has to do with, how can we use games as a deliberation technique with people and kind of build up, emerge from there. I was really interested in the 11 theses that was also posted. I read that as well, and um, I like this idea that planning must be also seen subjectively as a sensuous human activity, a practice embedded in social institutions in the natural world. So that's a big part of my idea of the research. I think the bigger questions, obviously didn't update this given today's talk, but I'm really interested in the pathways. Kind of, I mean, I was going to ask just before Raphael went to the slide about pluralism and how do we test this out in different circumstances, and Leonard's question about basically testing things out and if they fail and things like that. And I'm really interested in kind of the to use a simple strategic foresight tool is the three horizons, or like what is the current state, what is the intermediate state, and what is the ideal kind of end state, and how what is the middle state to get there, right? Is like how can we support the, as Raphael said again, the underlying infrastructure to get there and let kind of 100 flowers bloom in a way to explore how these models can work. Because I mean, I personally think it's unrealistic. Not necessarily that it's been said explicitly that any model would be applied universally. Obviously, that's like not the case. But even thinking more groundedly on how pluralistically this can be spread is really interesting, and designing for emergence there, especially given the crisis that we face in the 21st century, ecological, social, and so on. I do think that there's going to be a pull to planning, as there are already islands of plannings, as like economists like Ronald Coase would say. Planning exists, People's Republic of Walmart in circuits. I think there's going to be an expansion out of necessity to deal with these issues. And so how would the ideas from democratic economic planning, be implemented in the ideal form versus in the kind of intermediary form, and what considerations to that infrastructure to kind of build out over time, barring a revolutionary activity happening. I also wanted to shout out the kind of Overton window of a culture, because like Raphael, I live in North America in a I live in a very conservative province, and it's really not realistic, like at the present, like how do we shift the culture and get people excited, like kind of Morozov was roughly arguing about towards this direction. And then yeah, I kind of talked about the other pieces at the bottom there, but the top right image, just to shout it out, is a 2 by 2 matrix of scenarios that I did very casually in my attempt to do a thesis on economic planning in Canada back about 5 years ago. And I've been really excited about this for a long time. So I kind of pose those kind of question-esque things to the group. So thanks for that, and that comes in under 5.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's so many exciting things to dig into. Okay, we'll go to who's next? Jorge, you want to jump in?
Sure.
Also,
Yeah.
it's good. So we'll take some notes as well, because I think we can also revisit this in the next session, which, getting into the specific areas and topics of Jeffrey, I think thinking about games as well. Eric, I know, has been doing a lot on that and has a lot of research there. So
Also, Geoffrey, if you could share the slides with us, like with everyone, there must be like a list of like all the emails. That would be great.
oh yeah, you could put him in the Google Classroom link, actually. That would
Okay,
probably
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
drop them in the classroom link. Yeah.
Jorge, sorry.
Cool. Yeah. No. So as I said before, I've been working over the last, I don't know, like 10 years on in design, mostly strategic design, strategic foresight, the type of work that is close to what Jeffrey just shared. And lately, getting more involved, both in terms of my teaching activities and some of my practice on systemic and transition design. So both of these fairly kind of like emerging practices involve incorporating system thinking as well as foresight, transition theories, all that into design in order to get us designers to get involved in, addressing large-scale, complex, wicked problems. Systemic design perhaps is a bit more agnostic, it's perhaps more compatible with, it's a bit more technical, even technocratic, arguably. Whereas transition design is a bit more explicitly concerned with some of the issues that also animate these debates around democratic economic planning. So, the idea that we are facing, social ecological challenges, inequality, environmental degradation. I studied a short course on transition design back in 2018 in Schumacher College, and over these years, a couple of issues have been on my mind around these kinds of practices. And one of them is that none of these practices are, I would say, arguably, and maybe some people could debate me, but are not enough engaged with the most important structural determinant for these challenges, which is, of course, capitalism. So they arguably fall short of the type of political engagement and critical political engagement that we need. And also, the other issue is kind of like more almost personal, or at least kind of micro, in the sense that for some of us designers that have, made a career working within the sort of like capitalist system, it's quite inspiring to imagine working on transition, systemic change, and all that. But it's hard to find, like the spaces, sort of like the clients, the engagement models to be able to work on that. I'm reminded of a quote that I read recently in a book on the history of design. This German critical theorist, that says that designers are the handmaidens of capitalism. So, from this perspective, along with a couple of colleagues, last year we started a new project, kind of like a new practice or agency called Territorios Futuros, like future territories, where I've been following one of these colleagues who has more directly been diving into, and also has been connecting with people in the field of systemic investing. Which also kind of like from the more sort of like financial world is also attempting to engage with these social and ecological challenges. Systemic investing, and I'm pulling from the definition from a recent conference or summit. Systemic investing is the application of systems thinking to the practice of investing to help transform the human and natural systems we depend on in pursuit of social justice and a healthy planet. So kind of like with a similar, perhaps, concern about these challenges and perhaps vision. But of course, systemic investing is, to put it bluntly, basically just leveraging existing capital accumulation for, I would argue, sort of like addressing the superficial expression of what are the structural problems of capitalism. So despite that the name systemic investing, I don't see it as a properly systemic challenge to the system. So I've been exploring what are the alternatives. I'm perhaps thinking that some of the reflections that I will be getting from this roundtable, I will use to continue developing. I have a paper accepted for the upcoming Transition Design Conference in Mexico City in July. And I've been, so my paper is looking at looking as inspiration, the ideas from a recent book, which I would say is sort of like adjacent perhaps to these issues around democratic economic planning, is called Radical Abundance. By these three authors. I'm not remembering their names at the moment. But they build on the ideas of Ivan Metzaros and other authors to try to develop a theory of transition, as they call it. Build on a couple of ideas, One of them is popular protagonism, basically the idea of getting involved in these processes transforms people. And the other one, which is the one that I find most interesting, is what they call contested reproduction. Basically, the idea that workers, people need to start to develop sort of like an alternative, what they call metabolic system within capitalism as a way to start pushing the transition, explained very roughly. And in that project, and in that book, they propose one strategy illustrated with some of the examples of their own projects, because they run this organization called Abundance, and they propose the idea of public common partnerships. So I'm exploring in this paper the idea of pushing transition design, or being able to work on transition design in the context of public common partnerships as a way to address these two issues that I mentioned before. One is how to address the really structural issues of capitalism, and the other one, the more personal or micro, is how do we get to work as designers on pushing this transition. So I'm exploring the idea of working in the space of these public common initiatives as a way to sort of like address these two issues. And I see, and maybe I will incorporate this in the further for the next session, the institutional design that these authors propose. I think it's, as I said, at least adjacent, more perhaps micro, focused on the actual equivalent of firms, cooperatives, but quite compatible with the overall debate that we are having, or the themes that we're
So many
exploring.
exciting things to dig into. Okay. I'll close with next steps, but I want to hear from Joshua, and then we can set up some to-dos, some lightweight to-dos in our Google Classroom to help prepare for the next session. So Joshua, if you want to jump in with anything.
I prepared a very sketchy presentation. Just give me 1 second. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So basically, as I was saying, I'm working on this project on tourism, and trying to come up with, the goal of the program is to basically, we're doing like a spatial analysis of the island of Mallorca in regards to tourism. But the goal is to conceive of a kind of a prototypical design strategy for the island that could try and imagine how tourism could be conceived otherwise, as in a kind of a post-growth framework. And so I prepared a brief presentation of a few ideas regarding that. In regards to the text that we read, I found I just find the question coming back to me, like, what are the spatial effects of these individual models in each one of them on territorial scale, planetary scale, but also on a more smaller scale, medium and micro scale? What does it mean in terms of spatial design? For instance, this is a kind of an aside, but I did a little research project a while back on like the half-Earth hypothesis and half-Earth socialism, and what would that mean in terms of spatial networks that would kind of crisscross the entire globe, as kind of like wilderness networks that would span the entire globe, and what kind of spatial potentials would that also bring in a kind of a more qualitative, positive way, I guess. Another question I had was the question of scale, of the kind of intermediary between maybe the scale of the company or the firm or the consumer, and then like the planet almost, or the state, let's say. That kind of intermediary scale, which I think relates also to Mallorca as a kind of an island, and this kind of in between an entire state and just a smaller scale. And then the third one also relating to what was mentioned earlier about the kind of the intermediary steps to get to that proposed model. So how do we get there from what exists already, in a sense, in real life and in space, and how can we kind of source the existing forms of these existing kind of like germinal existing capitalism, post-capitalist forms in a sense. And that's what I was going to talk about briefly. I read this paper regarding pathways to post-capitalist tourism, which I found interesting. And so I'm just going to briefly introduce 4 examples that were mentioned in this paper of sort of actually existing post-capitalist forms of tourism. And then I'd like to pose the question whether they could be related to this problem of the island of Mallorca and how this notion of DEP might relate to that or might come into the picture. So the first example is Barcelona's relatively new municipal regulation, where the state, in this case, the city, acts against rentier extraction through rental caps, hotel moratoria, tourist taxation, etc. Essentially kind of top-down regulation that limits tourism, essentially, according to certain criteria that go beyond just purely financial criteria. I'll just be very brief here. Another example is an example of institutionally decommodified leisure in Brazil. These SESC, SESC organizations, where kind of a sectoral civil society body produces cultural and recreational infrastructure outside the market. And then we go down to a more sort of bottom-up approach, if you like. I believe this was an abandoned hotel, which was kind of recovered and squatted by workers in Buenos Aires, and kind of redefined as this cooperative model, which still functions as a hotel, but hospitality is kind of reclaimed under this collective ownership. And finally, there's another example in Mallorca itself of what I would call like a commons stewardship model, where a kind of a heritage landscape in one part of the island was reclaimed, again under kind of collective ownership and then managed by an ecological association, managed and kept by this ecological association. And I think they kind of map onto, maybe not exactly, but they kind of map onto some of the approaches and the models that we read about. So Barcelona, possibly more toward negotiated coordination. This SESC model in Brazil, more maybe towards sectoral institutionalism, etc. So you can kind of map these approaches to certain, at least to certain aspects of the models, which I find interesting. But then maybe the move would not be necessarily to pick one of these sort of existing examples as a prototype, but rather to see how could they be combined and kind of encompassed within a new model of post-capitalist planning for the island of Mallorca in this case, for instance. And so that kind of networking of finding this kind of governance model, which could include different approaches into a more comprehensive strategy, I think, or I hope, is related to the DEP question. Of course, it's maybe on a different scale. It's not necessarily the scale of the world economy, but yeah, I think that could be interesting to explore. Or I'd be curious also from you to hear from you what you think about this problem, if it even relates to what you've been speaking about, or in what sense it might relate. And yeah, basically, that's what I'd be interested in doing. Taking these concept of this concept of the protocol, which was mentioned in the text, and coming up with possible protocols for this very specific case study.
Yeah, this is awesome and so fascinating. I think lends itself to another point that maybe I didn't stress as much, which is like I see the mechanisms of DEP as a fractal, and they can be applied at different scales. And so I think the mechanisms and the components, you may see bits and pieces. And so it's like, what's the kernel? What are the kernels of DEP? And how can aspects of those kernels be applied to specific use cases? So thank you all for presenting so much. I think, in the interest of time, I think this was scheduled until 8, so I want to be really respectful of that. And I think one thing that we could do is, Joshua, I'd love for you to share the paper that you're basing your work off of. So I'd be delighted to read it before the next session. Jeffrey, you were going to upload your slides. Jorge, if you want to upload any things or things you're focusing on or interested in. And then Lenart and Nicola, Nicola, nice to have you in here. If you have anything that you want to share in the classroom as well to help us really fine tune and prepare for the next session. And Eric, I'll pass it over to you to maybe let us know what's going to happen in the next session or what you want folks to help prepare.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking, based upon what we talked about and based upon your inputs, what would be like the most interesting jumping off point. Um, I will be going over my notes and maybe I think I haven't made up my mind completely yet. I really wanted to adapt to how the session goes. Um, but I would certainly say, okay, we had the mandatory readings for the first session. Um, if you want to go over them again in light of this presentation, where you could see like with the things of like commonalities, like key questions, and really, I think what would be really interesting is that we collectively try to nail down a couple of key questions that different models, for example, the different models face. I'm just thinking about like a couple, the Hayek problem with the tacit knowledge thing, question of unit of account, and just so we come out at the end with a list of these key questions. Um, and then what would be really interesting or really cool if we have this optional reading list. Geoffrey already said, okay, he read the 11 thesis on planning part of this. If every one of you picked at least one text, like probably from the papers there, and then um, uh, talk a little bit about that specific text in light of what we talked about today. Raphael, any
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, Eric, you and I can discuss, but ultimately, like, I think the next session is going to be driven by you and what you're interested in and what you're focusing on. So this was a really helpful preview. So building on what Eric said, if there's a text that you want to pick and choose and relate it to your own research and your own work, and come prepared to maybe discuss it. But I think more importantly, having it would be great if folks dropped in any questions, because Leonard, I know you had questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to them. If you can drop in questions in the Google Classroom or alternatively just email us those questions, we can post them in the Google Classroom. We can that way we can have more of a roundtable discussion because we do have 2 hours next week. I think we can reserve a lot for continued presentations from you all, especially those who are doing this as part of a certification. I know some folks are just auditing or just taking a one-off. So how does that sound? So I'd say drop in material you shared today in either the Google Classroom or email us. Drop in your questions from today's lecture, either Google Classroom or email. Hopefully you've all read the required texts. That I think provides just a foundational baseline. But read, at least one of the supplemental texts. And it'd be wonderful to hear from all of you how you connect it to your research and the things that you're focusing on. And then come next week prepared to present. I think we'll have more time, so hopefully no one feels rushed. Um, and we can have more of an open-ended discussion. The group is small enough where I think we can also just go wherever we want to go next week, which will be really fun and exciting. And consider it the start of an ongoing conversation as well. I think both Eric and I are available and excited to talk about this material. So if it energizes you, it will energize us, and we can move forward from there.
I also wanted to say if you have any like specific questions. First of all, do you have access to our emails? So if you want to address that, mail us directly. Um, if you don't want to put it into the classroom. Otherwise, we can share them in the chat real quick. Um, so, oh my God, where do I find? But okay, I do
You
not
should have
find my.
access, and if you don't, you can also email New Center and they can forward it on to
Uh,
us. But
Yeah. So what do I want to say? Yeah, the email question, and then what was the other thing I wanted to say? God, it left my mind right now. Yeah, if you are like specifically interested on a very specific question or very specific aspect, also feel free to email us about that. We will try our best to point you towards literature or to researchers that address these questions. So yeah, feel free to take up that offer. Yeah.
All right. And with that, thank you all so much for the time and attention. It was really lovely to have you all and to do a first session, and looking forward to next week. So email us if anything comes up, email us your questions, anything else that pops up in your head as well.
Yeah. And see you all next week. Excited for it. And
Yeah,
talk to you in the
looking forward to
meantime.
it.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, Sislav, do we just leave the meeting? Okay.